This program is brought to you by the Emory University Center for Ethics.
So welcome, everyone, to the third Shields Lecture in Institutional Ethics at the Emory Center for Ethics. For those folks in staying room, we're trying to get you more seats, so just wait a moment. So I'm Gerard Vogt, and I direct the Martial Arts and Bioethics program here, and I'm really glad to welcome you all to this event. I want to share my sincere and heartfelt thanks to Brian Shields, who's an alumni of Emory's Business School, whose generous donation supports this ongoing lecture series, as well as a number of bioethics scholarships, of which we have a couple of scholars right here. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this wonderful discussion I'm really looking forward to with Carl Elliott from the University of Minnesota, with my colleague Jonathan Crane from the Center for Ethics here for the third Shield Lecture in Institutional Ethics. Carl Elliott grew up in Clover, South Carolina, where his father was a family doctor and his mother was a librarian, and his brothers Britt and Hal shared in his love of laughter, moral righteousness, and basketball. He attended Davidson College, the Medical University of South Carolina, and Glasgow University in Scotland, training first in medicine and then in philosophy. After postdoctoral positions at the University of Chicago, the University of Otago, New Zealand, and the University of Naval Medical School in South Africa, he joined the faculty at McGill University in Canada. Elliott moved to the University of Minnesota in 1997 to join the Center for Bioethics, where he's now a professor in the Department of Philosophy. Carl sometimes views his life as a clinical trial of identity question, and is ever grateful to his family, Ina, Crawford, Martha, and Lyle, for holding him accountable in that trial. Carl's professional successes in this trial are undisputed. Carl is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, the Carey and Anne McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Library of Congress, a resident fellowship at the Rockefeller Center, a Weatherhead Fellowship at the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe, the Calgary Medal in Healthcare Ethics, a network fellowship from the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, a fellowship from the Hastings Center in New York, and many other awards. Indeed. His writings appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Mother Jones, and the American Scholar. He's the author or editor of 8 books, and I'm very, very glad that we'll be hearing a discussion of his latest book that some of you hold in your hands right now. There'll be a book signing afterwards, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No, with my wonderful colleague, Jonathan Crane. Jonathan Crane is the Raymond Shinazi Scholar of Bioethics and Jewish Thought at the Ethics Center here. He's also professor of medicine at School of Medicine and affiliated faculty in the Department of Religion. He's an author of 6 books and has a book manuscript in progress on medical experiments that have been whitewashed or covered up or otherwise hidden from view. Given their expertise, I'm super glad that they're in conversation today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Before we just get started with a couple of housekeeping notes. So one is, if you've got your phone, please silence it. And number 2, if you're here for the Jones Program in Ethics, make sure you sign in. Without further ado, take it away, Carl and Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Can you all hear me in all of this? Excellent. So we are thrilled to welcome you, Carl, to Emory's Center for Ethics for tonight's conversation about your most recent book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice. I highly recommend it if you have not yet read it. I read it basically nonstop over winter break. It is a great, great read. Even if you think that it's not uplifting, it's still very good.
It's not. The opposite of uplifting.
So I have a series of questions for us to consider tonight, though I invite you to spin off and explore related topics and concerns as the moment inspires you. So let's start with the most obvious and perhaps the easiest, if not the most intriguing questions, which is, obviously, what inspired you to write this book and why now?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure inspiration would be the correct verb there or noun. Let me first just say thanks for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I guess the impetus for the book originally was becoming aware of a research scandal at my own institution back in 2008 at the University of Minnesota. This was a suicide in a clinical trial. A young man named Dan Markingson who was, clearly very psychotic and incompetent to consent, had basically been coerced under the threat of involuntary commitment into a research study over the objections of his mother, who then proceeded to spend the next 4 months trying to get him out of the trial, begging, pleading, warning that he was getting worse, that he was in danger of killing himself, that he was in danger of killing someone else, was completely ignored. And he eventually tried to decapitate himself with a box cutter in a shower of a halfway house 4 months into the study. And I was actually on sabbatical in South Africa when I heard about this. I read about it in the newspaper and was horrified. Horrified, but also kind of ashamed and, I guess a feeling of personal implication, because this was, well, it was my institution. I taught ethics there. I'd been on the institutional review board, and even though I wasn't on the IRB when this study was approved, I'd been on it and reviewed studies like it, and had been very critical of other institutions where things like this had happened. Very critical of the pharmaceutical industry, and this was an industry-funded study. And also kind of astonished that 4 years had passed since a research subject had nearly decapitated himself in a study at my own institution. I had never heard about it. I mean, how could this have been covered up for so long? But then when I got back, it was another couple of months before I got back from South Africa, and I started asking around, and nobody really seemed to be that upset about this, or at least not as upset as I was. And it eventually, after about a year of digging into this and trying to get to the bottom of it, it sort of became clear that the institution wasn't going to do anything about it. And so after finding out some other very damning information about the research design and the sponsorship of the study, I wound up writing about it for Mother Jones magazine, thinking that that a national audience might shame the university into doing something about this. My main worry was that there were other subjects who had also been coerced into studies in the same way. But that turned out to be a very naive idea. Essentially, the only result of writing about it in Mother Jones was to make myself an extraordinarily unpopular person at the University of Minnesota. And then spent another 5 years trying to get an external investigation by anybody, FDA, OHRP, Attorney General's office. Really, I mean, there were a whole group of us at the University of Minnesota working on this with no success at all, until finally, with the help of a former governor, Arne Carlson, we got a state investigation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which essentially confirmed every suspicion that any of us had about the trial, that there were conflicts of interest, that there was coercion, that essentially that he was not competent to consent, and so on. And so it felt initially like this was the beginning of a victory, or at least vindication. But then it turns out that being vindicated is not really a victory, because the university essentially did nothing. There was no compensation for the young man's mother. There was no reform at the university. There were no sanctions for any of the researchers involved. And, within a few months, the whole thing had been forgotten. And so sometime around this period, I started teaching a class on research scandals, mainly to try to figure out how these things play out at other institutions. Is the University of Minnesota a uniquely terrible institution? Or do these things play out just as badly at other places? And turns out most other institutions are just as bad. The pattern is more or less the same. Institutions always refuse to admit fault. They always protect their researchers. They do whatever they can to avoid compensating the victims. And the whistleblowers in the cases are fired, sued, ostracized, and generally made as miserable as possible. The other thing I learned about these cases is that whistleblowers are actually quite rare. In most of the scandals that we looked at in the book, it turns out that there are many people on the inside, doctors, nurses, administrators, hospital attorneys, who know that patients are being mistreated, that they're dying, that they're being coerced and deceived, and they don't do anything at all about it. It's really only very rare cases in which someone on the inside speaks out and tries to stop what's happening. And so I got interested in those people, those rare few, and sought them out to try to talk to them and figure out what their stories were like. And that's essentially what the book is a series of case studies and interviews with these medical insiders who exposed scandals.
And so I suspect that writing a book of this sort, which weaves together medical science, biography of these whistleblowers, scandal, philosophy, literature, religion, and ethics, that writing this synthetic book posed many challenges and forced you to make tough choices in the writing of the book. So I'm curious if you'd be willing to share some reflections on the decisions that you made in that process. It's a highly readable book, well documented. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to, say, your choices of style and voice and the level of detail that you folded into this particular narrative.
Well, yeah, sure. I felt as if, after talking to a lot of whistleblowers, I felt it as if one danger of writing a book like this was that it could become a kind of exercise in score settling. Because what you find with whistleblowers, and I wouldn't really consider myself a whistleblower, but kind of whistleblower adjacent. It's a kind of life-changing experience, and whistleblowers find it very difficult to let it go. It's almost like there's a kind of existential break. There's life before they blew the whistle and life after they blew the whistle. And after blowing the whistle, there's a constant sort of rehearsal, in their minds. What could I have done better? And in particular, an obsession with their enemies. I should say our enemies, because I'm just as susceptible to this. And I realized that could be a trap and that and I didn't want to fall into it. The other trap that I didn't want to fall into was sermonizing. And, you know, I really tried hard not to be terribly moralistic in the, you know, in the telling of these stories, and to kind of let the, you know, the sins and crimes that were committed speak for themselves rather than, you know, trying to prosecute these cases. But when I first started writing it, I found that it was, the way that I was doing it was just very kind of academic and dry. And my conversations with the whistleblowers was anything but academic and dry. I mean, they got very personal and very emotional very quickly. And I didn't feel like I was doing them or myself really justice by writing about it in that way. And so I eventually decided, you know, I need to put myself in the story, and I needed to kind of explain my own story and why I got interested in this in the first place, and to kind of make it personal, because that's the way it, you know, that's the way it feels. And so that's the way it's done. You know, I sort of placed myself in it. It kind of reads a little bit like a travelogue because, you know, these things took place all over the country. I went out to see Peter Buxton, the Tuskegee whistleblower in San Francisco, and then Ron Jones, the unfortunate experiment whistleblower in New Zealand, and then the Macchiarini whistleblowers in Sweden. And sort of, you know, it really took me all over. During the pandemic, actually, so that was another challenge, just trying to get to these places, you know, during the COVID pandemic.
And so that leads to another question about a choice that you made in, this is perhaps a superficial question, the titles of the chapters, I would have thought would have elevated the persons, the whistleblowers, the biographies, these very interesting people whose voices and experiences you want to champion, and you do very well. But yet the titles of the very chapters are not about the people, it's about the places where the scandals occurred. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that decision. Was it yours, or perhaps it was an editor's?
No, I mean, that was very simple because, I mean, in most of the cases, there are multiple whistleblowers. And so it would just be very cumbersome. I mean, Tuskegee would have been easy because Peter Buxton was, you know, essentially alone. But, you know, with the Swedish, the Karolinska Institute scandal, there were 4 whistleblowers. There were 3 in, you know, in New Zealand. It would have been cumbersome.
And a whole faculty in Cincinnati.
Yeah, well, it was mainly Martha Stevens,
Right.
but there were, you know, there were a lot of other people behind her. Yeah, so nothing terribly exciting there.
No, I think though that it reflects one of the tensions in this field, if you will, which is how to label. One of the things that you articulate very early on in your book is that you want to resist characterizing whistleblowers as either, how did you put it? You don't want them to be oversimplified as either courageous, selfless individuals or aggrieved malcontents, that they are complex people. And so I could imagine that it makes it very difficult to capture that complexity in sort of the chapter headings and subtitles and things like that. So you have to make a decision somehow. So I want to stick for a moment with the contemporary moment. That in many ways, the American society today embraces loyalty over honesty. And you demonstrate this midway through when you talk about American corporate culture. And perhaps something similar could be said regarding some elected officials, where they favor loyalty over honesty. Without getting too political here, could you share some more thoughts about how and why honesty, even tough honesty, which whistleblowing entails, is vital for the integrity and advancement of medicine and its related research?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of, probably this audience is, may know this, but I think a lot of people don't actually understand that medical research is not formally regulated in the way that other businesses are regulated. I mean, there's nobody from the federal government sort of standing over a researcher's shoulder and checking to make sure that they do what they say they'll do, what they say they're doing. So unlike if you're operating a restaurant, you have health and safety inspectors coming in and making sure that the restaurant is, clean and hygienic. You don't have that with medical research. Instead, you have this sort of oversight system that's not a formal regulatory system. And the oversight system is essentially an honor code. You have an IRB, you have an institutional review board, but the institutional review board essentially trusts researchers, right? It's a purely paper review prospectively of how the trial is designed and the plans for how it will proceed, right? So it's like an honor code at a college. But if you go to a college with an honor code and your exams are not proctored, you understand, and it's made very clear to you that it is your duty to turn in people who cheat. If you see somebody cheating on a test, part of the honor code is, you have to report them. The same should apply to medical research. It's really only insiders monitoring one another that we depend on to protect human subjects. And yet, in medical research, it doesn't happen. It's very rare that someone on the inside actually speaks out when they see some sort of misconduct. So, I mean, it is crucial, but it's largely absent.
And so are you suggesting then that there is an ethos of loyalty over honesty in contemporary medical research?
Well, sometimes it's loyalty, but I think sometimes it's, much more complicated. Sometimes it's just conformity. If other people are not doing it. It's also, I mean, the sociologists have done this sort of empirical work, and they've gone into various institutions. I don't know of any medical institutions this way, but corporations, government bodies where there's been some sort of scandal, fraud, financial crime, and ask people, well, why didn't you say anything about it? And largely, their answers are, one, I would have been punished for it, and two, it wouldn't have done any good. And they are absolutely correct in that assessment. Because when people do speak out, they are punished, and it doesn't do any good. But there are other studies that go beyond this. And it turns out that people are very reluctant to blow the whistle even when there's no possibility of retaliation, and they have good reason to think that it will do some good. And still they don't speak out. I think that is it may be more about loyalty, but I think it's a sort of larger sense of what is expected in the particular institution that they're working in. If you go to a college, for example, with a very strong honor code, and it's made clear to everybody, this is what is expected of you, this is what we're all going to do, that's the only way the honor code works. But if you're in a culture, if the institutional culture doesn't tell you that, and nobody else speaks out about wrongdoing or protests or dissents in any way, then the message that you get is, well, this is what's expected. This is the way it's done here. And so you don't either.
So we get complicated signals from our institutions that, on the one hand, they ask us to review and sign on and declare ourselves allegiant to an honor code, and yet at the other on the other side or on the same side of that coin, they don't necessarily follow through on punishing and transgression or rewarding disclosure of transgression.
Yeah.
And so you do make an argument in chapter 2 of this book that an honor code is at play in whistleblowing and for whistleblowers. And I wonder if you would be willing to spend a few moments sharing with those of us who have not yet read the book what that honor code theory is.
Well, so one of the things that that surprised me, I guess, when I was talking to whistleblowers, is my sort of the main question is like, why did you do it? Like, what prompted you to speak out about this? And you would think that there'd be a fairly easy way to get at that answer, which would be just to ask them that question. But what I found was that people would sort of very often answer the question with non-answers, they would not, I mean, it was very rare, even for the doctors that I talked to refer to any kind of professional ethics or the Hippocratic Oath, for example. Very rarely would they talk about the law or any sort of moral principle. What they would say were things like, well, if I didn't say anything, how would I hold my head up? Or what would I say to my kids? Or how could I look at myself in the mirror? This sort of thing. And even if there was a clear moral principle at stake, or even if part of the obvious rationale was to protect the interests of patients who are being deceived or, dying in the trial, that's usually not what they would talk about first. They would talk about themselves, And that's a kind of interesting, that's an interesting, sort of answer. Why do people talk about themselves so much when they've acted in order to protect the interests of other people? And I think that part of it is this idea, I mean, that I sort of explained in there, is the ethic of honor and shame. Because the ethic of honor and shame is all about, unlike, say, a consequentialist ethic or a utilitarian ethic or an ethic of civic virtue, of any other ways of explaining ethics, the ethic of honor and shame is all about your obligations to yourself, right? It's about trying to maintain your self-respect and to maintain the respect of others, particularly people that you respect, right? That's the sort of ethic of honor and shame. And so it seemed to me that when people said things like, how could I hold my head up? I mean, that's essentially a way of saying, how could I respect myself? How could I look in the mirror? Like, how could I respect myself? And so it felt as if this was a way of sort of framing the central moral dilemma in the book, which for me is, and I think for a lot of the whistleblowers, is how do you maintain your self-respect when you've lost the respect of your community? Because this is what happens to whistleblowers. They're vilified within their institution. And in medicine, they're vilified within their profession. And so very often, I think particularly with medical researchers, they've spent an entire career trying to gain the respect of their colleagues and sometimes have been very successful in doing that. I think particularly of John Pasando, the Fred Hutchinson bone marrow transplant whistleblower that I talk about. I mean, this is a guy who was at the top of his profession, scientifically, medically, research-wise. But when they start to speak out, nobody wants to be around them. they become completely toxic, radioactive in their institution. And very often this comes as a shock to them because, I mean, what you find is whistleblowers tend to be on the idealistic side. I mean, it's almost a requirement for being a whistleblower that you have a certain measure of idealism, because if you were totally cynical about the world, you wouldn't speak out. Cynics are convinced that it would be futile and that there's nothing good that's going to come out of this other than their own self-immolation. The whistleblowers, the idealists, think that if only everybody else could see what I see, if only everybody else knew the horrible things that are happening in this research study, they'd be just as outraged as I am. And they work so hard to get the word out through the press or an attorney or a regulatory agency. And then it becomes public and the very opposite thing happens. Nobody else is outraged. They become the villain. They become toxic and radioactive, and the institution does nothing, or nothing other than try to vilify them. And that comes as a kind of existential collapse for them.
Is another term for that moral betrayal?
Maybe. I mean, you could put it that way. Yeah.
And there's been a resurgence, especially since COVID, resurgence of attention to issues of moral injury and moral betrayal and moral distress. These are interlocking experiences, but especially I can understand from a whistleblower's perspective that they have a sense of what is good and right. They're upholding that, they're speaking their truths, and yet when society hears about these truths, they don't also resonate with those truths. And so their notions of what is true north begins to falter. And so there's a sense of betrayal that even society, the people who are not directly involved in this scandal, that they too are somehow complicit in upholding the scandal. And so that could feel like the terrain beneath the whistleblower is shaky and they sense a betrayal. And so given this experience of honor, this theory of honor that you think is animating and structuring for many whistleblowers and their experiences, I wonder if you could, if there might be something akin to a Goldilocks principle associated with honor. And I find that there's a Goldilocks principle associated with shame, and you think that shame and honor are interrelated here, and I agree with you on that. So the Goldilocks principle for shame holds something like this, that if one has too little shame or is shameless, one is disinhibited and may engage in nefarious activities with little compunction. At the other extreme, if one has too much shame or is shameful, one is so inhibited that one may never walk out the front door lest one do something untoward. So one needs to have just the right amount of shame to walk out that door and take some risks, but refrain from those risks that would be transgressive or harmful. And so this makes sense at the individual level, and I think also at larger levels, like the field of medical research and perhaps even for corporations. And so I'm wondering whether you might think that something like this could function with honor as well. What might happen if someone has a sense of too much honor or too little honor? And when does one have just a right amount of honor?
Really? Too much honor? Well, I mean, what would that be?
I could imagine somebody thinking that they are so honorable that they actually operate with a sense of self-righteousness.
Okay. Yeah. No, I can get, I mean, yeah, sure, absolutely. This is one thing, this is another thing that I was worried about in the book, because definitely don't want to come across as self-righteous. But I think a lot of the whistleblowers are perceived as self-righteous within their institutions, for sure. I mean, you know, it's a hard, and that's not even to say that, that they're not self-righteous. I mean, there's a weird dynamic that happens very often with, with whistleblowers, which is usually it is rarely the case that someone on the inside feels as if right away the only way to stop this, at least in the people that I talked with medical research, the only way to stop this is to go outside the institution. Usually, there's a long process of arguing and trying to push back internally and doing whatever they can to stop it quietly on the inside through the usual channels. And only after that doesn't work do they go to the outside, try to go to the press or an oversight body or something. But, that process of trying to push back on the inside produces a lot of distrust on both sides, right? And the more the whistleblower pushes back, the more that they make themselves sort of an enemy of the institution on the inside, and the more they're seen as somebody who has to be managed and controlled, and the more that they feel they're being managed and controlled or punished, the angrier they get. And particularly
That
when
sounds
they
like
make
my teenage son.
right. And then when they eventually decide to go outside the institution, that's when that's when the real punishment comes, because the main way that institutions try to control the whistleblower once they've spoken out is to discredit them, right? I mean, one of the epigraph I used for the book was from one of the whistleblowers, John Pasando, who the very first conversation I had with him said, every whistleblower is an amateur playing against professionals, right? And what he meant by that is the whistleblowers are going into this completely blind. Most of them don't even think of themselves as whistleblowers and don't even really know that much about what a whistleblower is or how this thing usually works out. But the institution has plenty of experience with this. They've been through it many times before, and they have a whole team of attorneys and crisis managers and HR people and communications people, all of whom are there to control the fallout of what the whistleblower has done. And the first thing they need to do is make sure that nobody believes the allegations. And the way to do that is to portray them as, self-interested, self-righteous, a crank, crazy, someone with a grudge who is acting out of their own interests rather than in the interests of patients in some way. But the more they do that, the angrier the whistleblower gets. And the angrier the whistleblower gets, the more convinced they become that the institution can't be trusted, that nobody in the institution can be trusted, that they're all corrupt. And they find themselves sort of locked in this cage match with one another, where both regard the other as mortal enemies, and they're committed to fighting to the death. Now, you could say that's too much honor, because one of the pieces of the honor ethic. I mean, when I talk about honor, I know people have in their heads duels and honor killings and the mafia. Insults require a response in the honor ethics. The violence is the very dark part of the honor ethic, and it's real. But, this sense that whistleblowers have of having lost their respect, trying to maintain their self-respect while dealing with the loss of respect of wider society, in particular their institution. I mean, that really cuts close to the bone for most of them.
Understood. It's sad but unsurprising that institutions would engage in ad hominem attacks to discredit the credibility of whistleblowers and to disparage their very character. And so this leads to another set of questions about power and power's tendency to redirect attention. So you mention in your book an article by Jerome Stevens in 1973 entitled Political, Social, and Scientific Aspects of Medical Research on Humans. That essay, you admit, had profound impact on you. You say reading it made the back of your neck start to tingle. That made me curious, so I went to go read it. In that essay, Stevens asserts the introduction of consent forms, ethical institutional review committees, and governmental guidelines have actually served only to keep the political and social aspects of experiments hidden from view. Ethical codes and consent forms, he says, give the illusion of protection, acting as shields to enable researchers and institutions to find protection from criticism. And then you write, apparently resonating with Stevens' prescient assertion, that today's system of protecting human subjects is a bureaucracy straight out of Kafka, a maze of commissions, consultants, compliance officers, accreditation bodies, professional societies, webinars, training courses, and for-profit ethics review boards. All of them are devoted to research protection, yet invisible to research subjects themselves. Virtually every major academic medical center employs a squad of functionaries whose primary directive is to shield the institution from sanctions and litigations. It feels like an elaborate betrayal. Jerome Stevens saw it all coming, you say. This is a fairly strong condemnation of mechanisms ostensibly designed to protect research subjects. Are they merely smoke and mirrors, and we should be skeptical of them all? Or could some of them provide real good or goods to medicine and its related sciences?
All right, so that's a complicated question. Let me go back. I got actually a good story about the Cincinnati scandal. George, does anybody know about the Cincinnati radiation scandal? This is one of the there were a handful of sort of iconic abuses of human subjects in the early 1970s. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook hepatitis study, various studies in U.S. prisons that Jessica Mitford wrote about. But the one that people don't know about is the Cincinnati radiation scandal, which in some ways is just a horrific scandal. This was essentially, it was a Pentagon-funded study designed to find out how radiation would affect American soldiers in case of a nuclear attack, right? So this was done mostly in the 1960s. It ended in 1972. But the way they were doing this was to take cancer patients, mostly Black, about 60, 70% Black, all poor, who were coming in for cancer treatment at the University of Cincinnati, and gave them whole body radiation, which was not at all indicated for their cancer. The whole purpose of giving them whole body radiation was to see how bad it would be. How long, they wanted to know, if a soldier's flying a plane, how long would it take before radiation exposure would cause them to pass out? How long could they fly the plane? Would they get nauseous? Could they see? And so they were doing this and measuring the effects of this sort of massive doses of radiation on these poor cancer patients. And the whistleblower was an English, who found out about this, was an English professor at the University of Cincinnati. She's from Georgia, actually, from Waycross, Georgia, named Martha Stevens. And Jerome Stevens was her husband. He was involved as well. Now, here's the interesting piece of this whole thing before I get to Jerome. So I had decided I needed to go to Cincinnati and talk to Martha. And she'd written a book about this. And I learned from her book that the University of Cincinnati had been forced, as a result of a lawsuit, to put up a memorial on behalf of the subjects who were mistreated in this trial on hospital grounds, on the grounds of the hospital. And so I thought, well, the first thing I want to do is go see that memorial. And so I turned to the hospital, wander around, can't find a memorial anywhere. Go to the front desk, ask, can you all tell me where the memorial is? Nobody knows what I'm talking about. I say, the memorial for the victims of the radiation experiments here. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They keep thinking I have a radiology appointment. Keep trying to send me to the radiologist. I'm like, no, it's a memorial, like it's a monument, Eventually, they find someone who they call the radioisotope lab. And they find someone there who knows where it is. And she comes up and she takes me like down into the sub-basement. And we walk around and it seems like this maze, and I'm thinking I'm never going to find my way back out of here. And she eventually takes me up a stairwell and leads me out to this courtyard. And it looks like the kind of place where hospital employees go to smoke. I mean, there's like, heating and air conditioning systems over here and a parking garage over here. And she says, here it is. And I'm like, where? Because I don't see it. And she goes, over there. And I'm like, and there's this giant, like 6-foot bank of shrubbery. And I'm like, the shrubbery? He goes, no, it's behind the shrubbery. And so I went behind there, and if you squeeze yourself into like 3 or 4 foot space between the wall of the hospital and looked out at the shrubbery, you could see this little plaque. It was about 2 by 2 sitting there with the names of, I guess they were the victims of the radiation study. There were close to 90, I believe, in that study. But it didn't even say anything about it. It just said, radiation in memoriam radiation patients, 1960 to 1972. And I'm like, okay. And then she said to me, would you like to see the Sanger lab? And I'm thinking to myself, Sanger? That was the guy who designed the studies, Eugene Sanger. He was the radiologist behind it, like the villain. And I'm thinking to myself, there's a lab named for the villain who designed this diabolical study? And I said, yeah, I want to see that. And she took me up to see it. And it's like a little shrine to him, There's, it's named after him, and they have all his prizes and medals and pictures of him and so on, a little case in the lobby. And I'm thinking to myself, this is if you want a visual image to represent this book, this would be it. The victims, they get a little plaque hidden in the shrubbery, and the villain gets this sort of shrine in the hospital. So that's my introduction to the radiation study. The woman who exposed it was this remarkable woman. I mean, by the time I met her, she was in her early 80s. I'm guessing she's in her late 80s at this point. And she was an English professor, a junior English professor, no tenure at all, read about this, an article, she thinks it was in the Village Voice. I think it was probably in the Washington Post, and kind of made it her mission to figure out what was going on. And so she went over to medical school. She, was relentless in trying to get records, and eventually got to the bottom of it, got a whole group of other junior faculty members with her, held a press conference. It wound up in the Washington Post, got the attention of Edward Kennedy, who was holding hearings on human experimentation, as it was called at the time, and eventually it made it into the congressional record. She, like a lot of the whistleblowers, things worked out fine for her. Hers is, I would say, one of the happier stories in the book. She wasn't fired. She wasn't really punished. She had the support of her department, and she did stop the study. As a result of this, they shut it down. But on the other hand, none of the victims were notified. None of the families were notified. They managed to keep it out of Kennedy's hearings. And today, hardly anybody knows about it. So kind of mixed feelings about the whole thing. Now, the article that you referenced was written by her husband, Jerome, who's a political scientist, and he was also involved in trying to get this thing shut down. What I thought was remarkable about his article was that for him, he said, look, the issue here is power. What we had here in Cincinnati were patients with no power at all, racial minorities, people with no money, who had essentially no power and really very little education, and were easily exploitable by very powerful researchers at the University of Cincinnati. And unless you get at that issue, this power imbalance between subjects and researchers, you're never going to fix this problem. And that, it seems to be a lesson that has never been learned. What I found when I was teaching this class on research scandals, probably the most depressing class you can imagine. It's like, all scandals all the time, 2 a week for a whole semester, just death, injury, deception, week after week. And I would say probably 90% of those, of the scandals that we talk about in that class are, the victims are people with no power in some way. They're people who are vulnerable. They are poor. They are racial minorities. They are uneducated. They are children. They are psychiatric patients. They are institutionalized. They are prisoners. There is some reason why they're vulnerable in some way. And you would think after, how long has it been? These scandals in response to, that this was in response to, were those very same kinds of scandals. You've got Black sharecroppers in Alabama. You have institutionalized mentally disabled kids in Willowbrook. You have prisoners. You have, these victims of the Cincinnati radiation studies. And the lesson that you should have learned, that we should have learned, that Jerome Stevens saw right then, the issue is the vulnerability of these patient populations. And unless you come up with some way of protecting them, then you're going to have those scandals again and again. And what have we had? Those scandals again and again. Now, I don't want to say that that the maze of bureaucracy has done nothing. Clearly things are improved now over the way that they were in the early 1970s, but they're not adequate.
So more definitely needs to be done, like telling these stories and rehearsing and investigating those earlier scandals. I'm right there with you on all of that. I have 2.5 more questions, and then I would welcome questions from the audience. So please prepare in your mind what you would like to say. And there are microphones hanging right above you that you didn't know. Yes, we are listening to you. That you can just speak directly from your seat. So be prepared. So 2.5 more questions. A trope stitching through most of your case studies is religion. I sense religion is very important to you, as evidenced by your use of sacred scripture stories and reference to community norms as support for your own and other people's whistleblowing efforts. Lest I mention the book of Romans and risk you nodding off, as you say, which elements of your religious tradition do you find most conducive to whistleblowing? And which elements curtail it? And do you think religions generally can cultivate a whistleblowing sort of ethos? Or is this more a secular civic responsibility, and that religions should focus on cultivating other kinds of engagement and virtues?
I think most of my family would be surprised when you say it's clear that religion is very important to you. I think it is, but kind of, I would say it's less that it's important to me than it is a part of me. I mean, I grew up in South Carolina. If you grew up in a small town in South Carolina, or at least in the era where I did, everybody went to church, and everybody, the number of hours I spent in church and Sunday school and church camp and Bible school and prayer meeting and all of this, and then go into a Presbyterian college. There are certain things that just get, I don't know, become part of your psychological architecture. And so this just tends to be the way that I think about a lot of moral questions. But a lot of it was that, there were some of the whistleblowers that I talked to for whom that same kind of religious upbringing was important. So most of the religious stuff you're probably talking about is my kind of my description of the idiosyncrasies of Presbyterians, of which I was one. And Ron Jones in New Zealand was a Presbyterian as well. They were all Presbyterians, actually, as half of the country in the South Island of New Zealand tended to be. It is also the case, I mean, as you will have noticed, that well, maybe I should just say the term whistleblower itself was an effort in the early 1970s by some people, because the early 1970s is sort of the golden era, is where the term whistleblower was born. So you get people like Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers and Frank Serpico with the NYPD. There was an effort in the early 1970s to rebrand this action of people speaking out against their own group for moral reasons from the earlier way in which this was referred to, which was, traitor, rat, snitch, and in particular, Judas. So in my telling, Judas is the first whistleblower, and I identify very strongly with him, of course, in the book. I'm just kidding, actually. But that is a kind of whistleblower story, and it's the sort of dark side of whistleblowing, and the kind of, I think, instinctive reaction of a lot of people to someone who does this, who speaks out against their own group, because it is seen as a kind of betrayal and a kind of disloyalty. And it takes a lot of convincing that, that there's some sort of, that there can be some sort of positive moral valence to this. And so the idea of whistleblowing, of calling whistleblowers was a way of trying to come up with a term that wasn't quite as derogatory as Judas or traitor, snitch, Benedict Arnold, narc. We've got a lot of.
And so that brings me to this course that you have taught, this class on research scandals. And I'm wondering about your decisions in that course, about the explicit curriculum and the implicit curriculum, and the tension that many of us face, especially in schools of medicine and perhaps in our companies or in our colleges, where we're trying to teach one thing and yet there's a culture around us that is conveying a separate, distinct, perhaps contrary message to the one that we are trying to explicitly teach. And so I'm wondering how you wrestle with the cultivating this sense of honor and shame that we spoke about a few minutes ago, as well as a pedagogy of cynicism, and how you manage that in a classroom setting. How do you manage both disclosing dirty laundry and yet giving young people or people who are new to this information despite their biological age, how do you inspire them to still have a sense of honor, a sense of integrity, and a sense of tenacity?
I don't think I do a very good job of any of that, actually. I mean, I do tend to be very cynical about a lot of it. I mean, I feel as if the best thing to do in the teaching is to teach the truth, like as I see it. And I don't think, I mean, maybe this will sound like heresy in a group like this, but I don't really think that teaching ethics does a lot to make people better human beings. Yeah. I honestly just, I don't. It might do other things, and I don't want to diminish those, but I think, I mean, this was one of the. So, like in medical school, I went to medical school late enough so that I actually got ethics, an ethics class. There was a professional ethics class, and we were all required to take it. But most of us kind of rolled our eyes at it. And what we were taught in that class was so very different from what we saw once we started taking care of patients, that it's, it just seemed, sort of a cross between insignificant and worthless. The culture, it seems to me that, this issue of getting people to do the right thing is more a problem of sociology and institutional culture and the kinds of structures that are there in the institutional setting when medical students start taking care of patients than it is anything that they actually learn. I mean, if I were to go back, like, you're talking to a guy who, I spent probably close to 30 years teaching ethics in various medical schools. And if I had to, and don't anymore. The University of Minnesota has decided that I would be happier in the philosophy department, so I don't teach medical students anymore. But if I were to do it now, I think I would start by teaching them the way that things can go so badly wrong, rather than the kinds of things that are actually taught. So yeah, I would start with scandals. I would start with the way that patients can be mistreated, the way that they often are mistreated, the way that clinical care can go wrong, the way that research can go wrong. And at least, I don't think that that can give anybody the courage to speak out. And I'm not even sure, to be honest, I would advise them to do that because, as you'll see in the book, it usually turns out badly. Almost all of these stories have unhappy endings. But I think it's good for people to know that. But I also think that it would be good for people to know what the moral cost of that is. I would like them to feel terrible about not speaking out. I would want to, even if they're going to do nothing, I would like them to feel ashamed of themselves. Maybe a small victory, but you take them where you find them.
And so that leads me to my very last question.
What's the half question?
Here it is.
All right.
What do you wish for the future of whistleblowing?
What do I wish for the future of whistleblowing? I guess, I would wish for some sort of positive resolution to it. Here's the interesting thing. So I would say there is one story in the book that ends in a way that I think for most outsiders would seem to be a positive result. It's like what we're all looking for, and that's the New Zealand story. It never works out well in America. I should say that. But in New Zealand, it took forever, but this was the so-called unfortunate experiment at National Women's Hospital. This was a study in which women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated for decades, and many of them got cervical cancer and died. When the whistleblowers finally managed to expose this in the late 1980s, the New Zealand government appointed a judicial inquiry. It was led by a woman judge, Sylvia Cartwright. They got started immediately, like within a month. They held public hearings. The researchers responsible were called to account and made to answer publicly. It was like in New Zealand, the Cartwright inquiry was like the Senate Watergate hearings here. It was just like everybody followed it, religiously. It was the most sort of notorious medical scandal in New Zealand history. But the women who were mistreated and their families got a voice. They were all given the opportunity to speak publicly. The researchers were sanctioned, found guilty of disgraceful conduct. The women were compensated, and then they remade their research oversight system completely and have not seen a major scandal since then. So since the late 1980s. That's what everybody hopes for, right? That's what I would like to see. Now, that said, even with that, here's the striking thing. For me, I look at that, and I think most of the other whistleblowers in the book look at that and they say, that's what we want. That's what we were hoping for. That's what we didn't get. But when I talked to Ron Jones, the whistleblower, the only living whistleblower left there, he doesn't even see it as a victory. He's still in his 80s now, he's still tormented by it for reasons that he really finds difficult to explain. So even that is what's so striking about this, about talking to whistleblowers. Even if it looks like this was a victory from the outside, it often doesn't feel like a victory to them. They still feel terrible about it.
On that happy note, we welcome questions from the audience. If you would like to raise a hand. Paul?
So, thanks, Carl, for not only this work, but your whole body of work. So, two quick things. One is, You talked about people's inability to articulate the reasons that they behave the way they behave. David Blumenthal, who was a professor of religion here, wrote a book called The Banality of Good and Evil, and he went and interviewed people who hid Jews during the Holocaust and asked them why they did it, and found exactly the same thing. They would say things because it was the right thing to do, or because how could you not help these people? And they couldn't articulate a reason, from which he concluded something slightly different than what you said, which is this sort of basic moral education that kind of gets into the marrow is what's necessary for people to behave that way further on, and which speaks to your, teaching ethics in medical school is way too late.
Yeah.
So that's the first, and then just a quick second point. So I was on the committee that rewrote Responsible Science, which is the sort of Bible of scientific misconduct. And the original book from 1992 bought into sort of the bad apple view of scientific misconduct. Some misbehaving scientist somewhere does something wrong. But in our rewrite of it, we very much took the institutional incentive position. That is, institutions give people incentives to behave badly, and that's why they do it. And I can't think of a system that gives more incentives to behave badly than scientific medicine, where not only does your career and your income and all of these things depend on you recruiting patients for your research, but then you're the one responsible for giving them the informed consent process to tell them why they maybe shouldn't do it. So the whole system is set up in order, is set up as a system that incentivizes the kind of bad behavior that you were.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Both points. I think you're absolutely right.
Other questions in the back?
Hey. So Carl, I took some of your seminars in 2017 at Minnesota. And one, I'll say that yes, the cynicism was healthy and was impressed. But two, I think you're correct that medical school education is inadequate to teach ethics. And I wonder about also the people you spoke to who couldn't articulate their point of view in sort of, maybe if you push them, did any of them speak about it in maybe two different ways that you could look at honor? One is the taking of oaths. And if you push them, they could go back to the Hippocratic Oath, though I don't think I ever examined the Hippocratic Oath until graduate school. And the second is maybe an intuitive sense of what our community holds as standards of responsibility. And the violence that you speak of is maybe a reaction to the sudden mirror of this is not what our community stands for, but no one else has the vocabulary for it either. So it's this person who has maybe more of an intuitive sense of what the right action is and speaks out. Did anyone you spoke to go in that direction when you sort of push them?
It was one of those things where it seemed to be different for everybody. I mean, one thing I can say about my own experience, in that regard, is that I never got any, among colleagues at the University of Minnesota, both in the bioethics center and then, in the academic health center, nobody wanted to defend this trial. Everybody agreed that it was, exploitative and deceptive and scientifically illegitimate, and that it was just a horrible result. That said, nobody thought that it was a good thing for me to be airing this publicly. Nobody, particularly my colleagues in the bioethics center, thought it was a terrible idea. And a lot of the pushback was one, this stuff happens everywhere, Carl. It's no worse here than it is anywhere else. Why don't you find another institution to go attack rather than this one? Why do you have to pick this particular scandal to turn into some sort of public affair? To which me, it's like, well, it's because it's our scandal. That's, we're the ones with the responsibility because we work here. And, you know, this is part of the ethic of shame, and you feel a kind of collective shame if you identify with the institution. It's like, you know, I feel terrible that my institution did this to, you know, to this young man. I have a responsibility to try to make it right. But the other thing, and you know, they were correct in this, the other thing that they would often say is, look, you've lost, right? You are never going to get any kind of good result from this. You need to admit defeat. The more that you just keep pushing this thing, particularly publicly, the worse it's going to be for everybody. And it's going to be bad for us. It's going to be bad for the Bioethics Center. We're not going to be able to hire more faculty. They're going to strangle us. They're going to, you know, they're going to punish us in some way, which was true. I mean, they did. But the irony is that everybody in the Bioethics Center stood with the administration and they still punished them. I mean, yeah. I mean, so why, I mean, if you're going to be punished anyway, why not do the right thing?
Other questions?
So you shared a quote from one of your interviews. Whistleblowers are amateurs trying to be professionals,
Playing against professionals.
playing against professionals. What exactly does professional whistleblowing look like? Like, I hope there's no seasoned veterans of. But if there was, like, you know, you said how successful outcomes are pretty hard to define. Other than the New Zealand case, it all ends badly. You know, for people to find themselves in that situation, like, what are some things that they should or should not do to ensure the best possible outcome, given that they choose to whistleblow?
Yeah, oh, I can tell you that. Just look at what I did and do the opposite. That would be my advice. One thing that I think a lot of people don't do that would be very wise to do right at the beginning is talk to an attorney. I mean, there's some, you know, I think that would probably be the first thought of people maybe in the corporate world. It's not the first thought that occurs to most people in medicine. But it's a very smart thing to do. I did talk to some whistleblower attorneys for the book, and I've gotten to know others after you know, the book has come out. And one thing they say, you know, the first thing that they tell a potential whistleblower is don't do it. Which doesn't mean don't try to stop the bad thing, the abuses of human subjects or the fraud or misconduct or whatever. It's that once you come out publicly, once you are fingered as a whistleblower, your life is going to be irreversibly changed and not for the better. So if there's any way to get information, I mean, I remember Tom Devine in DC saying this. He would say, if you can get us the information, let us do the work for you. Leak it to us, get us documents, you know, tell us who to talk to, let us do the work rather than trying to speak out yourself. And if you do have to speak out yourself, try to do it without being named. Now, if you talk to most of the whistleblowers, you know, in my area in medical research, they'll say, look, that's one, impossible. Everybody, like as soon as this thing became public, everybody would know it was me because I've spent years making myself a pain in the ass to the entire institution about this. The thing that I would say more than anything else is don't try to do it alone. Solidarity is the key. It's the key to success in the sense that it's, I mean, what the institution is going to try to do is say that you're crazy or incompetent or in it for some kind of financial gain or something like this. It's much easier to do that with a single lone whistleblower than it is with a group of whistleblowers. The smartest people who went about this were the four Swedish whistleblowers at the Karolinska Institute who blew the whistle on Paolo Macchiarini, who was a complete fraud and a con man, right? I mean, there have been several documentaries and Netflix series about it. I mean, this is a sort of famous case at this point. But they made an intentional decision right at the beginning that every decision that they made, they were going to make as a group. Nobody was going to speak without consulting the group. If anybody had to meet with someone alone, they were going to record the conversation and share it with the group. And that way, they were just much harder to attack. This is not to say they didn't try to do it. I mean, they reported them to the police, and so they were interrogated. They tried to fire them, but it's much harder to do if you are, in their case, like four very senior, 3 cardiovascular surgeons and a critical care doctor with a long and very successful career behind them. It's a lot harder to say these people are crazy or don't know what they're talking about or have a grudge when it's 4 of them rather than 1. The other thing is that the whole business of trying to do this lasts a very long time and is very lonely. Because you become isolated from, I mean, this is the other thing that, that is very often the most devastating thing for whistleblowers is very often, they just simply assume that their friends will stand by them. And what they find is that a lot of them don't. And even people who might be sympathetic are afraid to associate with them because they're afraid that they will be tarred with the same brush that this person is in. So you kind of make yourself radioactive within your institution and you lose a lot of friends and colleagues. And it becomes very, alienating and demoralizing and lonely. If you have at least a handful of people on the inside who are working with you, that becomes a lot easier to withstand. I mean, I don't know if you followed the whole Boeing, John Barnett whistleblower, the Boeing whistleblower. I was working on this book at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. when the Boeing scandal emerged, and then he was given a sort of whistleblowing award in D.C. while I was there. And there were 2 of them that were given this award, and I went to it. It's at the Carnegie Institute. And I can remember thinking, these 2 people who are getting the award look terrible. They were getting a standing ovation. But they still looked horrible. And I knew why. It was because, when the night was over, they're going to have to go back to their lives, which were probably very lonely and just difficult to withstand. And, 4 years later, he killed himself. That happens a lot more often than you might think. And I think it's a lot easier to avoid that kind of fate if you have people who are standing with you and who are kind of fighting it with you. I mean, I was very lucky that way at the University of Minnesota. There was a kind of small core of us working together. And then when one of that small core turned out to be an ex-governor, it was way better.
So we have reached the end of our time together, but I wanted to express to you our solidarity with you. I don't want to speak on behalf of this community, but I applaud your tenacity and your willingness to speak truth to institutions that don't want to hear it. And thank you for sharing your story and the story of so many whistleblowers in this amazing book, which I highly recommend again. May you have Godspeed and strength to continue telling your story, both here and wherever you go. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
This program is brought to you by the Emory University Center for Ethics.